Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my in-depth review of the Canon RF 100-400mm f5.6-8, a low-cost telephoto zoom designed for the full-frame EOS R mirrorless system. Announced in September 2021, alongside the RF 16mm 2.8, which I also have a review of if you're interested, the RF 100-400 costs around $649 or £699, and in this video, I'm going to show you exactly what it can do. Now, before going any further, it's important to note where the RF 100-400 fits in Canon's lineup. First, it's a native RF lens, which means it won't work on EF DSLRs or the EF-M system. This is only for EOS R cameras. Secondly, it is not Canon's mirrorless version of the hugely popular EF 100-400 f4.5-5.6L. That lens is a high-end L-series model with better build and a brighter aperture, costing around $2,400 in the latest version, making it almost 4 times the price of this RF lens. If you're looking for a high-end telephoto zoom in the native RF format, Canon's already got you covered with the RF 100-500 f4.5-7.1L costing around $2,800, and I have a full review of that model linked here and at the end of the video. So the latest RF 100-400 is a smaller, lighter and optically dimmer lens that's aimed at lower budgets. Think of it more like the EF 70-300mm USM in style. It weighs 635 grams and measures 80 by 165mm. Starting at the body end, there's a broad zoom ring that can be locked at the shortest position and which extends the barrel in one section by around 76mm when fully zoomed to the 400mm focal length. Next to this is a smooth manual focusing ring with a dedicated AF/MF switch, so you don't need to select manual focus in the menus. And finally, a customizable RF control ring. So it may be a budget lens, but at least the manual focus and RF control rings are separate and not merged into one. Finally, at the end is a 67mm filter thread. Sadly, like all Canon's non-L lenses, no hood is supplied as standard. There's no weather sealing either, at least not at the mount end, so if you're using it for outdoor sports or wildlife in wet or dusty conditions, do be warned. Okay, now to illustrate that 4 times optical zoom range in practice, starting at 100mm before zooming to 400mm, taking you from mild to long telephoto. And if you'd like more reach, the lens is compatible with the 1.4 and 2 times RF teleconverters, and unlike the higher end 100-500, they'll also work throughout the entire focal range too. Here's another example at 100mm showing the fairground section of the Brighton Pier before zooming in for a more detailed look at the merry-go-round and helter-skelter. And one more example for good measure, this time from Brighton Pier looking along the beach to the I-360 tower at 100mm before then zooming in on the distant details at 400mm. Now, many people only think of telephoto zooms for sports or wildlife, but I also love using them for landscape photography. So let's first see how the lens performs at long distances. So here's my side-on test view of Brighton Pier from about 200 meters away, with the camera angled so that details run into the corners. I prefer photographing distant subjects under daylight to test a lens rather than using a chart at close range, although I do also have portrait and macro tests coming up in just a moment. This was taken at 100mm using the maximum f5.6 aperture on the EOS R5, and taking a closer look in the middle shows a decent level of detail from the start. Closing the aperture to f8 or f11 made little to no difference to my results at 100mm in the middle of the frame. Heading out to the corner at the maximum f5.6 aperture shows the lens essentially maintaining this performance with only the slightest hint of softness or fringing if you're really pixel peeping. I'd certainly be happy using it wide open at 100mm though, which is good news since the maximum aperture of f5.6 isn't exactly bright to start with. Here's the same image taken at f8. And now at f11 to show there's little to be gained by closing the aperture. Next, here's the view at 200mm, where the maximum aperture is dimmed by 2/3 of a stop to f7.1. Zooming into the middle of the image once again shows very fine details with no evidence of any undesirable artifacts, and again no benefit to closing the aperture any further. Heading out to the corner shows the tiniest softening compared to the middle if you're being super critical, but to all intents and purposes it really looks very similar. Closing the aperture 1/3 of a stop to f8 makes no difference, while closing one stop further to f11 fractionally improves the sharpness, but again it's barely visible under most situations. And finally, here it is at the longest focal length of 400mm, where the maximum aperture becomes f8. Zooming into the middle again shows the lens can capture fine details without issues, and again there's no real benefit in the middle to stopping down to f11. Heading into the corners tells the same story as the shorter focal lengths too, so a very minor softening, but really nothing to be that concerned about, and little to no benefit to closing the aperture any further. But then at this point the lens is already at f8 with the aperture wide open, so you wouldn't really want to close it any further other than, say, to boost the depth of field. Speaking of which, the RF 100-400 has a variable aperture, starting at f5.6 at the short end, before dimming to f8 at the long end. But one of the most revealing and rarely discussed specifications is exactly where in the range that aperture decreases. So I've measured it for you and made this lovely chart showing the aperture values for the old EF 100-400 f4.5 to 5.6 at the top, the new RF 100-400 in the middle, and the RF 100 to 500 4.5 to 7.1L at the bottom. So the new RF 100 to 400 starts at f5.6 and dims to f6.3 at 113mm, then to f7.1 at 156mm, then to its minimum f8 from 259mm onwards. So during this last section it's one stop slower than between 100 and 112mm. This makes the new RF zoom dimmer than the two L models, but it's also considerably smaller, lighter, and as you know, cheaper too. In fact, roughly 1/4 of the price of those two L lenses, so clearly it is a completely different proposition. Now, charts are useful, but what you really want to know is how much blurring can you expect in the background with the maximum aperture at various focal lengths and subject distances. So let's start with a portrait taken on the EOS R5 with a lens at 100mm f5.6. Now, this focal length is ideal for portraits with flattering perspective, but the fairly modest aperture means you're never going to obliterate the background with blur. Taking a closer look though shows the lens can still capture sharp details of the subject at portrait distances, while the bokeh in the background isn't too busy or distracting. If you're mostly shooting portraits and want more blur though, go for the 85 f2. Now back to the full view at 100mm, before switching to a version taken at 200mm f7.1, where I've moved away from the camera to roughly match the subject size. The longer focal length means less of the background is visible, although in this case with the wall being closer to me, the separation isn't really any better. And now at 400mm f8 for anyone brave or foolish enough to attempt a long telephoto portrait. Again, the background blur is minimal, especially as I'm now positioned even closer to the rear wall, but zooming in on my eyes shows there's still good detail being captured, which bodes well for sports and wildlife. So, without further ado, let's switch me for some true Brighton natives, all taken at 400mm f8 with the background more distant to achieve greater blurring. Here on the pier, Steven Seagull is nicely separated from the background with very crisp details around the eye. And here's another example where I've positioned myself so the background has become very distant, which in turn has rendered the sea into a fairly uniform blur. And again, taking a closer look shows very sharp details on the subject. And finally, is this a starling? Either way, careful framing has allowed me to position the background as far away as possible, which in turn has delivered some blurring even at f8, while taking a closer look at the subject shows the lens is capable of capturing very crisp details. These are all mostly static subjects though, so let's see how well the lens autofocuses. Okay, so here's a single AF test on the EOS R5 using the 100-400 at 100mm and the maximum f5.6 aperture. Now, it may be pitched as an affordable model, but by equipping it with nano USM motors, the 100-400 focuses very quickly, confidently and quietly too. Next, for the lens, zoom to the longest 400mm end at the maximum f8 aperture, where it still manages to focus very quickly and accurately. So let's translate that into real-life performance with some moving subjects. Here's a selection of bursts I took of Brighton seagull population using the RF 100-400, mostly at 400mm and at the maximum aperture of f8. The lens was mounted on an EOS R5 using the full AF area with animal eye detection enabled and servo for continuous autofocus. These are all bursts using the mechanical shutter, which delivered around 10 frames per second in practice here. The combination of fast focusing motors driven by the R5's bird eye detection allowed me to easily grab bursts of erratic seagulls with an almost 100% hit rate, making the RF 100-400 a very usable zoom for wildlife and sports photography, at least under bright conditions. When zoomed to 400mm, the maximum aperture starts at f8, so if you want a fast shutter to freeze the action, you're going to need either bright conditions or a high ISO. Luckily, the latest EOS R cameras are able to focus effectively at small apertures and in dim conditions, while their high ISO performance can look pretty respectable. Now I'm at peace with this personally, but if you shoot under very dim conditions or desire the lowest ISOs or the shallowest depth of field, you'll simply need to spend more on a heavier lens with a brighter aperture. Speaking of depth of field, you've already seen what's possible at typical portrait and wildlife distances, but what about close-up? So here's my bokeh ball test, first with a lens at 100mm 5.6 from its closest focusing distance, where you can see a little blurring on the LEDs in the background, but unsurprisingly not a great deal. Taking a closer look at the blobs reveals a little outlining and mild textures within, so it's not the classiest at rendering out of focus areas, but again not surprising given the specification. If you want larger and nicer looking bokeh blobs at around this focal length, go for the RF 85mm f2 macro. That said, if you are able to frame your subject at 400mm, the lens can maintain the same focusing distance, resulting in much larger bokeh balls as seen here, even at the maximum aperture of f8. They're still far from perfect, but it does prove you can achieve some dramatic blurring if you're careful how you shoot. When it comes to macro performance, the RF 100-400 appears to maintain the same closest focusing distance throughout its focal range. This means quite modest reproduction at the short end of 100mm as seen here, where the lens can't even fill the frame with my 30cm ruler. I had to zoom to 113mm in order to reproduce 30cm across the frame. But by maintaining this closest focusing distance throughout its range, the reproduction keeps getting better the longer you zoom. So at the long end of 400mm, I measured reproduction of 86mm across the frame. Now, that's still not amazing, but it does open up the possibility of capturing some smaller subjects. Just make sure you zoom the lens in rather than attempting it at the shorter end. Moving on to stabilization, the RF 100-400 is equipped with optical IS that claims up to 5.5 stops of compensation on bodies without IBIS, or up to 6 stops for those that do. Set to 100mm on the EOS R6, I needed a shutter speed of 1/200 for a sharp result without any stabilization, versus 1/6 of a second when I had IBIS and IS enabled, and that corresponds to 5 stops of compensation. At 400mm on the EOS R6, I needed a shutter speed of 400th of a second for a sharp result without any stabilization, versus around a 50th when I had IBIS and IS enabled. And as always, Canon doesn't let you choose between them. If you have a lens with optical IS and a body with IBIS, they both work at the same time. Now, while that particular result worked out close to 3 stops of compensation on the day, my results down to a 1/6 of a second still look pretty good at 400mm. To illustrate the stabilizing effect in practice, here's an example while filming video on the R6. First at 100mm without IBIS or IS enabled, looks pretty bad doesn't it? And now with IBIS and IS, both enabled. Notice how it takes several seconds for the system to settle down and operate at its best, so if possible do wait a moment before you need to take a shot or start filming the action. And now at 400mm without any stabilization enabled, pretty bad, before turning it on, and as before you'll need to wait a few seconds for the system to fully kick in and start delivering the maximum compensation. Even once the stabilization was fully deployed though, I personally found it hard to handhold video at 400mm without some kind of support, but that's not surprising, 400mm is pretty long and of course your mileage will vary. Okay, now for a quick focus pulling test while filming video. First at 100mm 5.6 from the minimum focusing distance. Here there's a minor pause as the camera reacts to the change of subject, after which the lens smoothly refocuses. If you glance at the background during these focus pulls, you'll also see there's little to no breathing. Meanwhile, zooming the lens to 400mm does present a greater challenge to the camera when positioned at its minimum focusing distance, but it nails it most of the time. So from a more reasonable distance, here's a face detection and tracking test at 100mm 5.6. Sorry about the slightly off white balance here, that's my fault, not the camera. In terms of focusing though, the EOS R system can easily drive the lens for presentations to camera, although as with my portrait stills tests, if you'd like a blurrier background, you're better off going for something like the 85 f2 instead. What's that? You want to see the same test at 400mm? Okay, here you go then, with the lens at 400mm f8, a completely impractical distance for presenting, but one the camera and lens can handle if you really need to. And finally, before my verdict, a quick focus breathing test starting with the RF 100-400 at 100mm f22, manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again, where there's essentially no change at all to the magnification. And now at 400mm, where again there's essentially no breathing, so again no change in magnification as you focus. This is good news for anyone using the lens for videography, or indeed when manually focusing stills, especially in a magnified view. The lens also appeared to be mostly parfocal in my tests, meaning it didn't change focus as you zoomed through the range, so all in all, very well behaved in these regards. Okay, now it's time for my final verdict, and as I weigh up the pros and cons, I'll show you a slideshow of photos I took with the RF 100-400 on the EOS R5 and R6 bodies. As always, these are available to download in their original formats via my review of the lens at cameralabs.com if you're interested in a closer look. The RF 100-400mm becomes Canon's most affordable telephoto zoom for the EOS R system without adapting an older EF lens. It covers a useful range that's ideal for sports and wildlife, distant portraiture, as well as compressed landscape and urban views. The optical quality is excellent for the money, with sharp results across the frame, near and far, and at the maximum, albeit modest apertures. Now, Canon's kept the price, size and weight low by deploying a fairly dim f5.6-8 aperture, which means you're never going to achieve much blurring unless you're very close to the subject and the background is very distant. Importantly, for the target market of sports and wildlife, if you need a fast shutter to freeze any action, you'll also need to be shooting in good light or be at peace using high ISOs. As a low-priced lens, the RF 100-400 also lacks weather sealing and a lens hood in the box, although Canon hasn't skimped on focusing, which is fast enough to capture fast action, and impressively lacks any breathing. It also works with the RF teleconverters throughout the zoom range. If you're looking for a higher-end telephoto zoom, look no further than the RF 100-500 f4.5 to 7.1L, or adapt the still superb EF 100-400 f4.5 to 5.6L Mark II. Both are L-series lenses with brighter apertures, sharper optics, weather sealing, tripod feet, and they include lens hoods, but they're larger, heavier, and roughly 4 times the price. So while the RF 100-400 lacks their glamour, I'm pleased Canon's producing a selection of more affordable, not to mention lighter, native RF lenses alongside its flagship L series. And if you want even longer reach, also consider the RF 600 or 800mm f11 prime lenses, and I've got reviews of those too. And while optically dimmer lenses like these used to raise alarm bells on older bodies, the latest cameras are comfortable focusing them in poor light, while the high ISO quality just keeps improving with every generation. As such, the RF 100-400 is a very practical lens that's easy to recommend if you want long reach from a native RF zoom without breaking the bank or your back. And that's it for another lens review. I'm trying to review all of the Canon RF lenses, so if you're interested in another model, do check out my channel to see if I've already covered it. And of course, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any of my upcoming reviews. If you'd like to support what I do, don't forget you can treat me to a coffee or yourself to some CameraLabs merchandise like an official t-shirt or a mug, or my in-camera photography book. And as always, there's links to everything, including the best prices on the lens, in the description and pinned comment. Thanks for watching, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.